I'm so happy to have Maia Poet here. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you so
Thanks
much
for
for having
coming.
me on.
Yeah. Um, it's a little funny because I normally have people just like come here and I don't know too much about them, but I was talking to you a lot on the ride over and I was just learning a lot about different topics and the stuff we're going to be talking about. So, but yeah, I appreciate you coming by and this will be a drink combo. Um, I'm Andy. You can follow me on Instagram, Northwest Fresh Podcast. Yeah. Before we get started, I just wanted to say, like, obviously, yeah, again, thanks for coming on. I think you're at like the forefront of this whole kind of changing movement. It seems like, do you see yourself that way?
I don't know if I'm at the forefront of the new movement, but I'm certainly participating in it. I'm a pretty active participant.
Yeah. Um, I think it's cool though. And I think what you're doing is really brave and important. So I don't know. I just wanted to shout you out in that way.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah, let's get right into it. I wanted to shout you out because I saw your testimony on the what I don't remember what city that was, but you were testifying for it was like a book thing for a school, which I thought was totally relevant to what they were talking about. But I thought your testimony in there was really brave, and I'll put a link to it in here. But yeah, your little story or your story in there, I thought was really fascinating, and I wanted to just get into that and tell people your story and why it's so important to you.
Yeah, totally. Where would you like to start?
Um, yeah, I guess just tell me about like growing up and how you got into the transition movement and all that stuff. And
Yeah, so when I was 12, I got an iPad for my birthday, and I was really exposed to the concept of trans. I mean, for the first time before I was 12, I was probably 9 listening to NPR on the way to school. And, I'd heard of the topic or of the concept of so called sex changes. And I thought of this as something that, only men do, men who want to become women. And a few years later, when I finally got an iPad for my 12th birthday, I guess a lot of things were going on in my life, and I ended up finding the concept of transition really fascinating. And, I've been sort of to this day trying to figure out how it is that I got bombarded with so much trans content at that age. Um,
I was just wondering, do you consider yourself an iPad kid? Is that what they call
well, so I think that the term is like an iPad baby,
iPad baby? Sorry, yeah.
but I wasn't a baby. So I mean, I was born in 99. So
Okay.
the first model iPad that I got was the original one, and I got it in 2012. And it was the one, it only had like 8 gigabytes of storage. It,
Oh yeah.
it, it didn't even have a camera on it. So yeah, so I got really into into the trans topic. I mean, as a younger kid, when I was about 8, I was really fascinated with a very rare brain tumor on the pituitary gland called acromegaly, and it's a pituitary tumor that basically, inhibits the body's ability to stop producing growth hormone, and so these
Hmm.
people just grow and grow and grow, and they often die at young ages, and it's asymmetric growth. And so, anyways, I was obsessed with this
Is
topic when I was like
is
8.
that what like Andre the Giant had? That those like is that that's not gigantism or
It
that?
is
Oh,
gigantism.
okay.
It is,
Interesting.
yeah,
Interesting.
gigantism is like kind of the colloquial term for it. But I became really obsessed with that topic at about, 8 years old and obsessively researched it. So I did have a certain, penchant for like obsessive medical research online
Mhm.
starting from a very young age. And so, I think that like around the time that I got into this whole trans thing, I was 12 years old, and a lot of things were going on in my life. I mean, I would attribute one major catalyst to this moment I had in in school in my Arabic class in middle school, where we were engaging in the American cultural ritual of take one, pass it down, a stack of worksheets,
Okay.
and and my hand briefly brushed by the hand of one of my female classmates. And I started to experience all of these odd sensations in my body. Like my body really warmed up. I felt, kind of dizzy, just flustered in general, sweating and all these other sensations in my body that I didn't know how to categorize. I didn't know what they were. I now know that that was a crush, but back in those days, because I was like a weird kid who enjoyed researching odd medical topics online, I was not really very good at. I didn't have much in common with other kids my own age. So when they were talking about crushes, they were obsessed with crush this, crush that. You know, it's a talk of middle school, and I didn't know what that was. Like I thought that they were talking about the orange soda,
Yeah.
and that they were just really obsessed with it. And so I didn't know what that was. I just saw it as a bunch of odd sensations in my body. And so of course I went to WebMD, typed in all of these symptoms, and WebMD told me that I either have the cold or the flu or one of a few different neurodegenerative disorders that would kill me pretty shortly. So I became really neurotic about my impending death. And I actually told my parents, about these symptoms. Of course, I didn't tell them about the context because I thought the context was totally irrelevant. And so they took me to the doctor. You know, I got an asthma test, I got an EKG done, and everything showed that I was totally healthy. So I was like, okay, it's possible that whatever I have, they just didn't diagnose it, and I'm gonna try not to think about it because if I die, I die. There's not much I can do at this point.
You
So
just
I had
accepted
really,
your fate. Yeah.
I just accepted my fate. I mean, yeah, I had thought myself into a spiral, and so I spent a lot of time doing this medical kind of lay medical research, and I mean, also around that time, I was I did realize that I didn't feel all these odd symptoms when I was hanging around boys. I
Mm.
didn't feel that. So I started hanging around boys exclusively, and we would form these like kind of prank brigades where we would, pull some practical jokes on the teacher while she turned our back to us, and we did this because we wanted to elicit laughter from the girls. And like none of us had discussed that this was our shared goal, but this was pretty clear to me that this was our shared goal. And after some time, the older I got, the more I realized that the girls they're giving attention to my male classmates and not to me. And so I think that's part of why I thought, I that there was something wrong with me as a
Mm.
girl, that I wasn't meant to be a girl. And so I guess the question popped into my mind of like, is it possible for a girl to get a sex change?
Mm.
And at the same time, I was also really fascinated with like the gay rights movement. And so I did a lot of research about that, and I was really into the Ellen DeGeneres show. Like I
Okay.
thought,
Yeah.
yeah, like,
I remember that was a huge show. I think I was working at an NBC station when that was going on.
oh wow.
Right? Because wasn't it a big daytime show? Is that the one you're talking about? Or are you talking about the sitcom?
No, the sitcom is before my time.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
I'm
was a
talking.
huge show. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I was really into it, and I was really into Ellen DeGeneres because I thought she was a super snazzy dresser, and she was really charismatic. And I was a theater kid,
Mm.
and I'd really never seen women who dressed like that.
Mhm.
And I just thought it was the coolest thing ever, and I really wanted to dress like her. But it became pretty clear from the reactions of those around me that this is a very socially unacceptable thing for a girl to do. I mean, it's fine for girls to be tomboys until they hit puberty, and then suddenly everybody expects you to femme up because most girls do that. They develop attraction to boys, and so then they sort of put a lot of effort into their appearance
Mm.
and with the long hair and those clothes that they wear and the, makeup and all that jazz, like to attract mates. And so a lot of tomboys do kind of become more feminine as they grow up because most of them are straight. But, I wasn't trying to attract boys. And so, but I didn't know what was going on. I was very confused. But I think that because I spent a lot of time watching the Ellen DeGeneres show, and because, it's all linked together under the acronym of LGBT, because Ellen DeGeneres is a lesbian, I started getting, a lot more content that was trans related, and also spurred on by the fact that I literally searched in Google, is it possible for a girl to get a sex change? And so I started reading a mixture of like, research articles, the few that I could find. And I also saw there were a couple like kind of pop psychology articles. There was that article about so-called trans kid Jazz Jennings, who had already appeared on Barbara Walters in 2007, and so in 2012 is when I got into it, and so and then of course a lot of the content that I saw was on YouTube,
Mm.
and it was videos of it was a mixture of videos of kids and adults who were transitioning. Like there was this whole everybody thinks that the trans kid movement started in like 2015, but it actually, started before then. I mean, as far as American kind of media coverage of this, we can see the topic of children transitioning being covered in like the mid 2000s.
Hmm.
And children have been transitioned in the Netherlands really starting in the early 90s.
Wow.
So, like, this has been going on for a lot longer than people think.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's kind of the backstory of sort of how I got sucker punched into this in my estimation. Um
Yeah, that is really interesting because, like what you were telling me when we were driving over here, it was really I didn't actually know that. Like I knew the Netherlands was kind of the hub of a lot of this stuff, but I didn't know it had started that early. That's kind of wild to me. Because like I said, I was even under the impression that it was like a 2015 social contagion, I guess you'd say. But I don't know. The stuff you were telling me, I was just like, I've never heard any of this. This is really interesting. So it had actually been going on quite a while before that.
yeah, I mean, I think you're right in that there was a 2015 social contagion certainly, but I mean, trans has been socially contagious since it started. Like the first major case, the first major trans story to hit the headlines was in like 1951, and
Okay.
that was Christine Jorgensen, formerly known as George Jorgensen, and he was an American GI. He, after he finished his service, he stayed behind in Europe. He went to Denmark, and he was in search of an endocrinologist who would treat him and who would try to give him a quote unquote sex change. And um, and he found a Danish endocrinologist named Christian Hamburger. And upon his, like Christine Jorgensen wrote a letter to his parents, basically saying that, you know, mom and dad, like I know you think that I've been here just sightseeing, but I've done a little bit more than that. Yeah, like you don't have a son anymore. I'm now your daughter. Like and the way he discussed it is he said that he had some kind of a glandular disorder.
Hmm.
Though there's no evidence of
There's no
the notion that he
data.
had some
Yeah.
kind of a disorder of sexual development or glandular disorder or anything like that. But it was his way of trying to rationalize why he did this. And, anyways, so he wrote this letter to his parents, sent it over, and his parents decided to give the letter to the local tabloids who
Mm.
covered his story. And from that moment on, the Danish endocrinologist Christian Hamburger, who treated Christine Jorgensen, and Christine named himself after this Danish endocrinologist. Christian Hamburger, the endocrinologist, started getting a ton of letters from like the most remote areas of the world.
Hmm.
I think he got something like 1,117 letters, or
In a
something.
short time period.
I mean, over probably. I mean, I don't know how long it took him to get those letters, but
It
it wouldn't have been like 1,117 DMs on Twitter. Like
right,
it
right.
would have
It takes a lot more effort to
it
write a letter and like
exactly. And so like, from the moment that Christine Jorgensen's story leaked, there was the first big trans contagion, though the first quote unquote sex change procedure was actually performed in Germany in 1931. I mean, before Christine Jorgensen, these were really like one-offs.
mm,
And
mhm.
then I'd say the first wave of contagion began from a newspaper article. And Christian Hamburger actually took a portion of the letters and he basically analyzed them, and he figured out that there were a few main motivations that these patients wanted to pursue a quote unquote sex change, as it was called back in those days. The men he had basically put into a few main categories. There were the men who were effeminate homosexuals, and they were a minority of the patients. And then most of the men were non-homosexual, and they had, they felt the non-homosexual men who wanted gender transition, basically he put them into two categories. There were like the fetishistic cross-dressers or the transvestic, cohort, the ones who basically had this compulsive desire to cross-dress. And then you had another cohort of patients that had like pretty severe body dysmorphia. And the women, and there were not that many women who reached out to him compared to the amount of men, but the women who reached out to him, they were all lesbians, and they didn't express any particular distress with their female bodies, but they just wanted to marry their girlfriends.
Hmm.
So that's kind of how that first cohort looked. But, at some point, Denmark, that had become the hub of this for a little while, basically had to shut down its services because it took a huge toll on their healthcare system, and it was
Hmm.
totally
Hmm.
untenable. And so,
It was taking all the resources from their healthcare system, basically,
yeah,
or
like
a lot of them. Yeah.
yeah, and there were a lot of foreigners who were seeking these services. So it just became a really difficult situation for them. And so, I don't know exactly how this practice moved to the Netherlands, but then it did move to the Netherlands. And the Netherlands was the main hub of it, specifically in a Christian hospital in the Netherlands. Um, and anyways, but like I could go on about the history forever, but to connect it back to the social contagion, like, there have always been a really small micro minority of men who are kind of compulsively desiring to self-feminize or to self-castrate. Like, there have been religious groups and cults that have done this, you know, for a very long time. But even men outside of these religious groups, there are just some men who are really, really compulsively driven to feminize. And so, like, there would be some men who would castrate themselves, and there would be other men who would drink horse urine. And some of the first synthetic estrogen was derived from horse urine, so they understood that they would feminize by drinking this horse urine. And so, anyways, there have always been a micro minority of men who've really wanted to castrate themselves. But the notion that this desire stems from them somehow being women on the inside, this idea that we would call trans or gender ideology, this idea is a very recent phenomenon within the broader phenomenon of this micro minority of men who are obsessively driven to castrate themselves. And it seems like, because there is this cohort of men who really want to castrate themselves, from the moment that they're presented with a story, whether it be on a newspaper or whether it be on the internet in the modern age, um, you know, men with these types of desires will latch onto it. And apparently, also starting in 2015, a totally unprecedented boost and just wave of teenage girls who are also prone to various socially contagious ideas. In the past could have been, eating disorders or self-harm or things of that nature. And so, like, yeah, I mean, there's the trans phenomenon is it's kind of a misnomer because it's actually, like, it is one phenomenon, but it's not one cohesive phenomenon, I'd say. There are so many different groups of people who transition for different reasons, and you can pretty accurately categorize them based on their motivations. Like, there are just certain groups of people who are, who are driven to pursuing this path.
Hmm. And I had a couple questions. Like, did they all? Would you say they all are in the mission of just improving their lives as like a higher level goal? I guess,
I mean,
even though that might not be the best way to address that.
nobody transitions thinking it's going to make their life worse.
Right. Yeah.
It's a really drastic thing. Like, I guess to go back to my own story,
Yeah. Well, that's what I was gonna. Do you consider yourself part of that 2015 women's movement, or was this
no, I
before?
I wasn't I got into this in 2012.
Okay.
I got into it really early. Like, I think I got caught up more in the millennial contagion, even though I'm Gen Z, I'm 25. So,
Gotcha.
um but yeah, so anyways, so when I was 12, I basically latched on to the idea that I should have been born a boy, that this explains everything perfectly. Like, I felt really awkward. I felt, very uncomfortable around other girls. I mean, when I would, it seemed like all the other girls in like the locker room for gym class, they had no problem changing in front of each other. But of course, that made me really awkward and flustered. So I would just walk into the locker room, put my eyes down, walk right into the stall, and then walk out with my eyes on the floor. I was just so awkward around girls because I was attracted to them.
Hmm.
And because I didn't know what this was, Like I knew that gay people existed. I knew that because I was obsessed with the gay rights movement before I was obsessed with the whole trans
Yeah, and
topic.
you said you're into Ellen, so you had to know.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
knew what gays and lesbians were. I knew that some men fall in love with men and some women fall in love with women, but the missing link in the chain is that I didn't know what it meant to fall in love.
I see.
I didn't know that the feelings that I was having and the sensations in my body were a precursor to developing the type of, you know, romantic attraction that ends up becoming love.
Hmm.
I had no clue. I was a very confused kid. And so, like, yeah, so I basically, I think I got, yeah, I was really an early adopter of this stuff. And, I'd started to see all this stuff about, trans kids. And there were a lot of doctors who would go on these documentaries covering the trans kid issue. And they would talk about how, how you need to intervene in kids' bodies immediately, how if these kids don't transition, they're basically doomed to end their own lives.
It's all that kind of alarmism, scare tactic kind of stuff you hear about. Yeah.
Right. So after I'd adopted the trans explanation for why I had all these odd feelings and why I wanted to wear, more masculine clothes and have shorter hair and why I just found it so much easier to relate to guys and especially at that age I was more similar to the boys in my class in some ways than to the girls in my class. And so, I had this kind of rigid set of categories about, what's acceptable for girls to do and what's acceptable for boys to do. And so I put myself in the boy category. And you know, I was also starting to plan my life a little bit at 12. I mean, I grew up speaking English and Russian, and then when I was 12, I started studying Arabic. And at the age of 12, had a feeling that perhaps I wouldn't live in the United States for the rest of my life. Like,
Hmm.
my parents are immigrants, and so I just thought like it's very possible that I will live in another country and it's going to be probably one of these conservative countries that speaks the languages that I speak. And so even before I was willing to admit to myself that I was gay, like I envisioned my future with me having a wife.
Hmm.
And and I just knew, especially the older I got, I just come to the conclusion that you know, like I don't know if gays will be able to get married when I grow up. Like all the adults saw gay marriage coming down the pipeline. Like they could predict this, but 12-year-olds don't have they don't have perspective
Hmm.
because they've been on earth for 12 years. They, you know, th-
They're
so
not thinking about national policy of
right.
countries and stuff.
And
Yeah.
so I just thought like if I want to have a normal life, I'm going to have to live as a man.
Mm.
Like, I'm already so different from my peers now, like, it's just gonna get worse. That was my thinking, although it's very flawed thinking because it's objectively harder to be a weird kid than it is to be a weird adult.
Mm.
Because when you're a kid, you don't have that much control over your peer group.
Yeah.
But when you're an adult, you have almost total control over who you surround yourself with. So like, yeah, so I really got into this and I became pretty hell bent on transitioning and I came out to my parents as trans all in 2012 when I was 12. And they, of course, put the kibosh on that immediately. I mean, they're very, skeptical of institutions, extremely skeptical because of that sort of Soviet background.
Mm.
And so I guess, they said, no, you're not going to do this. And they knew that I was getting these ideas from the internet. And so they put spyware on my iPad.
Mm.
And because it was such a I mean, it was kind of the groundbreaking machine at that time, but it was objectively not a great piece of technology. And so the spyware made the iPad basically unusable. And so I just went to my school library and because they had internet and they had books, and I found a few books. There were some LGBT books, some anthologies, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender anthologies from like the 90s and early 2000s, and, stuff of that nature. Not tons of books, but there were books and so I started to read through these books and I read through the lesbian and gay ones, stories in the anthology, and then I started reading through the trans stories, and it was just kind of the same type of story that I was hearing online of like, all these people saying like, oh yeah, I was, they basically talked about experiencing kind of horrific homophobia, and then they transitioned, and the thing is they didn't present entirely a rosy picture, but they did talk about how, like, transitioning was very beneficial to their lives
Mm.
because, they got to, you know, um, experience like a frictionless existence.
You can express yourself freely, that kind of thing.
Right, and they didn't have to worry about the sort of social blowback of being very gender nonconforming homosexuals. And of course, again, in 2012, like, I wasn't reading this thinking, "Oh yeah, this was writing from the olden days."
Hmm.
Like, I didn't realize that society had actually changed,
Mm.
because I was exposed to this kind of old, like, the kind of like old school transsexual content, and it provided a much more complex vision of transition. But 12-year-olds are not great at conceptualizing of complexity.
Hmm.
Like, you basically just read into it exactly what you want to read into it. And so, you know, I mean, and a large through line in some of the more modern books that were in my school libraries nearing the end of middle school and beginning of high school, it was really more explicitly like um pro trans and pro like affirmation. And you know like there were books that were written by the parents of trans kids who were
Mm.
for some reason in my school library, and some autobiographies of quote unquote trans teens. And so I was reading that stuff, and I was using the internet at the school library to figure out where I can find more books about this topic. And so I just found more ways to spiral and spiral and spiral. And of course, I found other ways to access this content online. And online, they I learned about all the different trans procedures that females could get done to appear more male. And of course, like the content on YouTube was much more sort of uncomplicatedly pro trans. Like, people would not talk about their doubts. They would just present this image, because they would present this image that this was like a really kind of easy and kind of that it solved their problems.
Hmm. It's all upside. There's no downside.
Right. And that's because they were early into their transitions. All these people, they were, you know, they had just they filmed their journeys from sort of before hormones, and then they'd say, "Hi, my name is X and this is my voice 1 day on testosterone, 1 month on testosterone, 1 year on testosterone." So, they were in the beginning of their transitions, and even the original Dutch clinicians noted that there was a honeymoon period
Mm.
with these transitioners. They noted that, like, the first few years, like, there is this massive kind of euphoria that comes along with somebody embarking upon this path, and that patients had described this euphoria really, regardless of how far they were into transition. And so, and the major problems and the increased rates of suicidality in the male patients following sex reassignment surgery really came largely about a decade after the surgery was performed. But so there's a honeymoon period where somebody has basically thought, I finally found the thing that's going to make me feel better, and that's going to make me, I don't know, more normal or more true to myself, or however they conceptualize of it, whatever their motivations are. And the longer they go along, of course, when you're transitioning and you're living a life in opposition to your biological sex, you bump up against reality constantly.
Mm.
And so this actually creates the very incongruence that a lot of people transition to alleviate in the first place.
Mm. Mm.
But anyways, so on the internet, some of these doctors in the trans documentaries and all that jazz had basically talked about things that trans teens can do to alleviate their gender dysphoria. Doctors would nod to it, but a lot of trans influencers would just show you how to do it, and it was breast binding. So, I asked my parents to buy me a breast binder, and they obviously said no. But the trans influencers online, like, they told me exactly how to
Mm.
bind my breasts, and they said, "Look, there are safe ways to do this, and there are unsafe ways to do this." And of course, there's no evidence to corroborate the idea that there is any safe way to compress chest tissue, breast tissue,
You're
including
basically
your lungs
basically
and your rib cage.
stifling your own growth and body, right? At that.
Right, and so I was convinced at that time that, like, I'd bought into the idea that, like, okay, my parents are not gonna put me on puberty blockers, and it's already too late for me. I've been in puberty for a few years, but, like, there are 2 types of, like, breast removal surgeries for, women who wanna transition, and one of them is basically liposuction. It's called the keyhole procedure, and they don't have, this one doesn't come with obvious scarring, and you're eligible for it only if you have small breasts. But then if you have larger breasts, you can get the double incision mastectomy, and that has the scars. And of course, I just wanted to, you know, live as like a normal man. I thought that that would be my only way forward to live any kind of a fulfilling life if I didn't want to be a freak. And so I thought, well, like, okay, my parents aren't going to let me transition now, but you know, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start binding my breasts because maybe that'll prevent them from growing large enough to the point where I'm going to have big scars across my chest when I'm an adult and I get this surgery. So,
You saw it
you
as
know,
your only option, pretty much.
yeah,
Yeah.
I thought it was my only option. I mean, yeah. And so, anyways, so I started binding my breasts with, a variety of different implements. I mean, these trans activists online, they'll basically say, like, don't bind your breasts with ace bandages. But then they'll show you how to bind your breasts with ace bandages. And when you're a 12-year-old and especially adults tell you like don't do something,
Right.
like
You're
you're
gonna
you're
do
going to
it.
do it.
Yeah.
And especially when they say like, you know, that it's either this or you're going to kill yourself.
Right. Right.
I was like, I'd never thought about suicide before then, but they just put this idea in my mind that, if my parents didn't support this, that, I was basically doomed to end my own life.
Right.
And so,
That is it. I actually never thought about that of getting like that's the first inception of that idea for some people is from the pro community of like, hey, they're just introducing that idea to you for the first time.
well, yeah, and I mean, suicide is also very socially contagious, which is why there are guidelines about how it's reported in the media because we know that it's highly socially contagious, and so like I became hell bent on doing what I thought would like save my life and save my future and make it. I thought I was investing in my future, and so
And also kind of prove your parents wrong, of
oh,
course. Yeah.
definitely, oh,
Yeah.
that was totally part of it because
Yeah.
they said, oh yeah, this is a phase, you're gonna grow out of it, and this is another thing that if you think your kid is going through a phase, the last thing you want to tell them is that you think they're going through a phase because they will be determined to ensure that it is not a phase.
Right. Right.
And in my case, this phase was 12 years or half of my life.
Wow.
So, anyways, I was binding my breasts. I started with like ace bandages, but that became unbearably uncomfortable. And so I started finding other ways, and the internet had suggested to me also like that you can layer up a bunch of sports bras, a couple in each direction, that'll squash your breasts. And so I did that for a while, and I started developing posture issues.
Mm.
So my parents, not knowing why, they just I mean they probably thought that I was insecure about growing breasts, and so I was slouching, but I was actually already damaging my breasts and my posture and all that jazz. So I then I went to a chiropractor, and then I got like this kind of back brace sports bra garment, and I kind of finagled her into giving me a smaller size
Mm.
because those garments are already pretty tight. And so I got a smaller size because I, again, wanted to compress my breasts even more. And I basically never took this thing off for years. Like, I only showered once a week for 10 minutes because I was convinced that if I had spent any more time not wearing this thing, that my breasts would grow even more and that I would have to have these big scars across my chest. Like, that's the reason I did it. Like, had this idea never been put in my mind, I think that I would have just maybe worn a sports bra for a couple of years, worn some kind of baggy clothes, and I would have had to get over it. I would have had to. But, because I had already bought into this entire belief system and I started, engaging in the rituals associated with the belief system in the hope of improving my aesthetic outcomes, as in adulthood post transition, I already started to do damage to myself at that young of an age. And anyways, so fast forward a few years and I'm 18, I'm in college, and I realized like I finally, I'm living away from my parents for the first time. And so I buy my own breast binder from a so-called approved company, safe binder, they call it.
I didn't even think about that. They have approved. Of course they do, I guess. But
Well, yeah,
There's
I
like
mean,
certified products you can get.
they say that there are safe ways to do it and unsafe ways to do it. And there are no, again, there are like no studies that attest to that attest to the fact that this can even be done safely. Like
Right.
you're compressing tissue that is not supposed to be compressed.
It's like a safe body harming device, basically, right? Or they're claiming it's safe.
Yeah, it's like whenever they say there's like a safe way to bind your breasts, what actually, I don't know if this is what they mean, but whenever the proponents of transgender medicine or whenever trans activists say that an intervention is safe or reversible, whether it's breast binding, genital tucking, or puberty blockers, which we now know beyond a reasonable doubt are not in any way reversible. I mean, they're reversible insofar as if you go off the puberty blocker, your body will resume puberty, but you will have already experienced at least a couple years of delays, and in some cases, permanently harm your pituitary function.
Mm.
And so it's a question of, you know, even if a kid goes off puberty blockers, the extent to which that's reversible. But like in 98% of these cases, the kids go on to cross sex hormones. So it's clearly not just a neutral time to think or a pause button. It actually slants them in a direction towards transition because in before we medicalized these kids, like at the same time as the Dutch had already started their medical transition protocol, in North America and in Canada specifically, there were like psychologists and psychiatrists who treated kids with so-called gender incongruence or gender identity disorder. The most notable of which was Dr. Kenneth Zucker, and he basically like he had boys come into his clinic, and there was no the culture of affirmation did not exist
Mm.
back in those days. I mean, we're talking about a patient cohort from like the mid 80s onward. And so these boys, they were just brought into the clinic, and what we know about them, they weren't affirmed as girls. They were just kind of watched, and there were like some kind of support groups and play groups and, psychotherapy where necessary. But like when you left these kids alone, the vast majority of them, something like 87% of them, by the end of puberty and into adulthood, they'd grown out of their gender dysphoria. It had just disappeared, and the vast majority of them grew up to be gay.
Mm.
And we're just talking about boys. And so, yeah, before we medicalize these kids,
Wait, you just remind me of something because I think you said this in your testimony, and I never thought about it in this way. But because I've talked about it on here before, of like how middle school and that time is just it's basically the definition of awkward for anyone going through puberty or just that whole time in their life. And you just never made me think of that. Of like, it's just it is that way for everyone, and this is kind of capitalizing on that movement. And would you say that's kind of what happened to you as well?
oh,
That
yeah, totally. I mean, nobody likes puberty. And
and like I don't know, I just thought that because you
yeah.
said they'll grow out of it, and it's like that's awkward for everybody. Like it's an awkward time, and if you wait a few years, you'll probably feel better
Well, yeah.
as
And,
in general, right?
and also, we're talking about two different cohorts here because, like, the patients that were being medically transitioned in the Netherlands, the kids, and the patients who were not being medically transitioned or transitioned in any way, but just overseen in Canada, these are kids who, from a very young age, were either extremely gender nonconforming and their parents were concerned about their sons playing with Barbies and being very effeminate, and so they brought their kids into the clinic, or their kids were actually expressing cross sex identity claims saying, I wish I were a girl or I am a girl.
Hmm.
And this was pre puberty. These were little kids
Hmm.
who had started to experience this so-called gender incongruence. So what we're seeing today is a huge wave of teens, some of whom had, a prior history of some kind of gender nonconformity, but like, or like gender issues, but most of them don't.
Hmm.
Like most of them develop these gender issues in adolescence, really after being exposed to the concept of trans. I
Hmm.
mean, some of them,
Hmm.
like a lot of them have some kind of underlying mental illness. I mean, there are really high rates of autism. Some of these kids are gay,
And you're
though
saying
I would not say that's the majority, but
you're
yeah.
saying that's very different from the young kids that have the other issue.
Yeah,
Like,
when we say that kids grow out of gender dysphoria, that's a statement that we can substantiate for the cohort of prepubertal onset gender dysphoria. But as far as the teenage onset gender dysphoria, time alone is not going to help these kids
Mm,
because they've been indoctrinated.
mm,
Like they have some kind of distress, and in the midst of this identity exploration, which is very normal for adolescents, like adolescence, one of the key roles of adolescence as described by Erickson is, you're basically you're trying on different roles. Like you figure out
mm.
who you are by putting yourself into the shoes of the other. And this starts in early childhood when kids play dress up. Like they're trying to, impersonate a different role because that's how they sort of figure out the boundaries of, who they are
Right.
in reality versus these, other roles. They have to put themselves into the shoes of other people. And then in adolescence, that kind of happens again,
Mm,
but with a different type of identity exploration. And also adolescents are trying to individuate from their parents.
right. Right.
And so what better way is there to separate yourself from your parents than to say, "Oh, mom, I'm nothing like you. I'm
Right.
I'm not even your daughter.
I'm not who you think I am.
I'm not who
I'm
you think I."
somebody
Yeah.
totally different. Yeah.
Right. And so like we know a lot about children who present with gender dysphoria pre-puberty. We know far less about this cohort of teenage girls that really, spiked 10 years ago.
That's the newer phenomenon. You.
It's the newer phenomenon, and now there's now there's like a similar thing going on with teenage boys, but to a lesser extent. So there are fewer of them, but like yeah. So with a teenage onset cohort, you know, because they've been indoctrinated, because it's not like an organic thing that they have these questions about their gender. Time alone is very unlikely to resolve their distress, and so a lot of, to this, trans activists would say, oh, well, then the thing that's going to resolve their distress is transitioning them. And I'm like, no, there's no data to substantiate that in any way. Like, these kids need to be de radicalized and they need proper psychotherapy. I mean, a lot of them have pretty significant mental health challenges. And some of them, like I didn't have particular mental health challenges. I was just insanely confused. And so for the teenagers, you know, we we really do need to take a more kind of therapeutically informed approach to helping those kids think through how they've come to this conclusion about themselves. But like, you know, when I was 18, I went to college, was living away from my parents. I bought the so-called safe
Hmm.
breast binder. And I started binding my breasts. I started my social transition. And by the and I changed my name in the school portal, and the portal said that they were only going to send mail home that had my legal name on it, not my preferred name.
Mm,
So I was like, okay, I'm in the clear. But that ended up being false, and they had sent mail home with my preferred name on it. So my parents saw it. They knew I was transitioning. They were very unhappy about that, and
mm,
they said, look, we're paying for your college. And if you want us to continue paying for your for your college, you are not going to medically transition, and you are going to study abroad in a non-Western country that doesn't promote all of this gender stuff. And so then I was thinking, okay, well, I was still hell bent on transitioning. I wasn't going to let some parameters that my parents put in place.
Did that? Yeah. Did that drive you even more to continue on? Or
Oh, of course it
yeah.
did.
Yeah.
Of course it did. I mean, I was hell bent on this path. I mean, I was from the age of 12 convinced that I would kill myself if I didn't do this.
Right.
And so like I thought that I was in a desperate bid to save my own life, and furthermore to live a normal life. I mean, hell, like even in college, in I entered college in 2017, there was this culture of like sharing your preferred pronouns, and I could never stand it. Like I was I'm very gender nonconforming, and I could never stand it when
Mm,
anybody asked me what my pronouns were. I hated, because I didn't want people to notice that I was different. I mean, that was the whole reason that I
Mm.
wanted to transition in the first place. And
You
so
just
when
want to
people would
be
ask me, my
blend.
pronouns are call me they, them,
You wanted to blend in,
I
or
wanted to
something.
blend
Yeah,
in. Like
yeah,
I didn't want to be a freak like that,
yeah.
So there were multiple reasons I got into it, but like, I mean, yeah, like I was in this culture of like the pronoun sharing and whatnot, that also compelled me to want to medically transition even more.
Mm.
Um, because yeah, I never wanted to have people ask my pronouns again. I couldn't stand being called they, them. Even in the height of my trans identification, I would have rather had somebody just call me she, her. Um,
That just made you
because
feel weirder.
at least, yeah, exactly. Because they, them just made me feel like a freak all over again.
Mm.
And so, anyways, like, um, so I had to pick a country to study abroad in.
So they were serious. They were like, "You're going to a different country at this point."
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, they were hell bent on getting me out of this.
Mm.
They were very concerned about the long term ramifications of these procedures and this way of life, and they knew that I was way too cognitively underdeveloped and immature to even conceptualize of all the ramifications. Like they knew me, they knew their kid, and frankly, I don't think that any like kind of autistic spectrumy 18-year-old is frankly capable of making these decisions. I mean, I'd be, hard pressed to think that any 18-year-old is
Yeah.
capable of
Well, I was thinking, do you
making
think?
these types of decisions either. Like yeah, like when your brain is not developed, like that, and the doctors are just actively lying to you and telling you that this is medically necessary, life-saving healthcare, that it's settled science, like
Right,
all these
right.
lies they tell you. Nobody of any age can actually give informed consent when
Hmm.
they're being misled about the nature of their condition
Hmm.
and about what the treatments can what the treatments are capable of doing to them. I mean, they don't even list the full range of side effects. And they tell patients that that they could meaningfully become the opposite sex, and not that these are just body modifications. Like they make all these false promises to patients. And I mean, I just don't think that anybody can actually give informed consent when they're told that transition is the only option for treating gender dysphoria, when like this is not true.
Sorry.
Hi there.
Come on, come on.
So anyways, I chose to study abroad in Israel because, following my brief stint of pro-Palestinian campus activism, um
I didn't know about that.
I used to be
Yeah.
super woke, and I studied Arabic starting from the age of 12 in a program funded by Qatar. Qatar houses Hamas. So we know the type of indoctrination that I received in those Arabic classes. And, I was a debate kid, and I went to a debate camp in high school, and they gave us a really one-sided lecture about the Israel-Palestine issue. They basically said, "Yeah, Palestinians are not terrorists. Like there's no terrorism. They're freedom fighters, and like the Jews are the Nazis." Like it was a very one-sided
Wow.
lecture, and I was the only Jew in the room, so all eyes were on me. And
That's
I was convinced that, my people were responsible for the world's evils. And so I became a very staunch pro Palestinian activist. And following that, the Jewish campus organizations, they saw that there were like three token Jews on the pro Palestinian side. And so they called us in. And it was myself and my girlfriend and some other guy. And the director of the Jewish campus organization, Hillel, had talked to us, and he said, "Look, I think that I know you're very passionate about this issue, but I don't think you're getting the full story." So, and he says, "Look, we're going to take a trip to Israel to study the Israel-Palestine conflict at an institute in Jerusalem, and we'll pay for everything. You just need to apply." And so I thought, "Ah, sick, free trip to Israel." So I go there with my girlfriend, and we study at the institute in Jerusalem, and I start to realize that the left was totally lying to me. Because we spoke to a variety of people, to Israelis and to Palestinians from the West Bank, and they just said, "Yeah, like the Palestinian Authority is super corrupt, and I would love nothing more than to be a citizen of Israel because I want to have rights, and
Hmm.
Israeli Arabs actually have full civil rights, and under the Palestinian Authority, I have nothing." So I was in Israel, and then after this trip was, after this study at the institute was over, my girlfriend and I had extended our tickets, extended our stay, and we spent a few days in the West Bank. And the first night we stayed in a refugee camp in Bethlehem, and then the next night we stayed in an Airbnb that was the mansion of a Palestinian millionaire.
Okay.
And so two very different slices of Palestinian society. So in between our travel, from Bethlehem to Nablus, we were in a shared taxi and we missed the stop. So we ended up in a different city entirely. We ended up in Ramallah, or I guess Ramallah as you say it in English. And, my girlfriend and I were just two tourists with our huge suitcases wandering around. For some reason, Google Maps just wasn't working on my phone. And so we had to try to find our way to our next location. And we had to do it the old fashioned way of using your mouth and asking people.
Mm-hmm.
So we ended up wandering around, and some guy who owned a coffee shop was outside smoking a cigarette, and he sees us with our suitcases, and he sees we're tourists. He speaks to us in English. He welcomes us in. We sit in his cafe, and he is just thrilled to have tourists. Like he probably didn't have a ton of tourists
Mm-hmm.
come in, and so he was very generous, and he gave us free coffee and free hot dogs, and he sat down with us and we chatted a bit, and he talked to us about his family in the States that he had, and he really wanted to practice his English, but like I wasn't there to help him practice his English. I was there to practice my Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point in the conversation, and my girlfriend and I looked around in this cafe, and around us are only men. There are men playing billiards, there are men watching sports games on the TV, there are men smoking hookah. It's a men's environment, which is normal because in the Arab world, it's a very homosocial society.
Right.
Like, men have places where they hang out, and women have places where they hang out. But like, if you're a tourist, you can get away with things that the locals can't. And so, I was sitting there, and my girlfriend and I talking to this guy. And anyways, like, I tell him that I speak some Arabic, and his eyes light up, and he starts speaking to me in Arabic, and he refers to me in the masculine.
Mm.
And that's the moment in which I realized, like, whoa, like, while in the United States, I get perceived as a gender nonconforming female and keep getting asked my pronouns all the time. In this part of the world, they don't really know what a butch lesbian is, and they don't know what a trans man is.
Mm.
They don't know what a non binary is. And they just think I'm a guy that looks young for his age. Like, this is the perfect non Western country for me to pick to study abroad in. And so, I mean, I also had like a I also had like a bar mitzvah at the Western Wall that I didn't know happened until it was over. And I realized that like in these traditional societies, I would just get perceived as a man.
Mm-hmm.
And so I realized like, yeah, while my parents want me to pick a non-Western country so that I don't transition, I've just found the perfect non-Western country to transition in. So I apply for a study abroad in Israel. I get in the following year. I go to Israel and I study abroad. And in the university, I'm everybody knows me as a woman, though a lot of my Arab classmates were very confused by me because they thought I was a guy, but I was referred to as a woman, and because all my documents said that I was a woman, and I wasn't going to make the same mistake of trying to get the university to change my name because they send mail home, and so
Mm-hmm.
I learned my lesson the first time.
Right. Right.
And so I keep living, at the university, I'm a woman. But in my private life, I introduce myself as a guy. So I'm already living a double life. And then COVID happens and a lot of the international students go home, but I am committed.
Yeah. And you don't want to leave that situation you're in.
No.
Yeah.
And I mean, the society was fascinating. Like, I had already started learning Hebrew, so I got to speak four languages every day. And like, English, Russian, Arabic, and Hebrew are the most commonly spoken languages in Israel. So I was living my best life. I was very intellectually stimulated. I was living in a new culture and I was thriving.
Mm-hmm.
And I was living as a man. And it was great. Um,
Was it like it was like the finish line that you had been kind of waiting for that whole time?
yeah, I could finally do the thing that I'd always wanted to do. And so I was doing that. And, um, I finished my degree online. through Zoom. So I was studying at all crazy hours of the night, and I became like an Israeli-Palestinian peace activist, and I had this very rich social life, very complex web of social ties, where very, very few people knew that I was actually female.
Mm,
Very
mm,
few.
mm,
And so, yeah, like, so I was living this life, and I had no questions about this being the right path, because I could hang out, like I could hold a girl's hand in public, like not in the West Bank, because even if they did perceive me as a guy, like this type of public display of affection is like very
Just
taboo.
PDA in general. Yeah.
Right. So like I mean, in when I was in most like normal cities in Israel, or like in the city center of Jerusalem or wherever, like not in the ultra Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods, obviously, but like just in most areas of my life, I could just be normal. Like I could hold a girl's hand. Um, nobody would question it. Nobody would give me shit for it,
Mm,
basically. And so I was living a life where I could kind of dress the way I wanted to and behave exactly the way that I would behave normally, and I didn't feel like I had to change anything about myself. And of course, when you're in transition, and especially when you're keeping it a secret from everybody around you, there are naturally a lot of moments where this new reality that you've constructed for yourself that is in direct opposition to your biological reality, like when fiction brushes up against reality,
mm,
it creates a lot of incongruence and a lot of instability. So, there were a lot of moments where I got, close to being exposed. But like, the first moment that I started to question this stuff was really in 2021, when I lived through my first war in Israel. I was with a different girl at this time, and we were getting ready to head out to some concert in Tel Aviv. And we were, two people with ADHD, just kind of delaying leaving the house. There was always something to do. The cats needed to be fed, the plants needed to be watered, yada, yada. Anyways, as we were getting ready to finally leave, we heard a siren. And I look at this girl and I'm like, what the hell is that? She's like, they're launching rockets at us. And I'm like,
Was it like a different sign? Not like an ambulance. It was like a military type sign, like a crazy.
yeah, like it's not, no, it's not even, it doesn't sound like an ambulance siren. Like,
Yeah.
and and they'd at the university, like different cities in Israel will periodically test their sirens.
Hmm.
And if you're an Israeli, you know about this. But if you're a foreign student studying in a university, the university will tell you, hey, you're going to hear a siren, and it's going to, and they treat it like a drill,
Right.
basically. It's like in the United States you'd have fire drills, and in Israel they have missile
Yeah.
drills,
Because you're
rocket
kind of in a
drills.
war border zone type of thing. Yeah.
Right. Like, and so, I knew that I was supposed to go to a safe room or a bomb shelter, but I didn't know where it was. And so I look at this girl I'm dating. I'm like, what the hell are we supposed to do? She's like, we're supposed to run to a bomb shelter. And I'm like, well, where's the bomb shelter? And she's like, I don't know. I'm new to this neighborhood. So the first few sirens, we just run down to the lowest level of the apartment complex, because you're less likely to get hit either by a rocket or by rocket debris from the interception of the missile with Iron Dome if you're lower to the ground as opposed to higher up.
Hmm.
And eventually we figured out where the bomb shelter was, and we had two cats to pack up, and you don't have much time. Like the bomb shelter was the closest one we could find, was like a 5-minute
Wow.
walk away. And so we would just run for it. Um,
And you got to carry all this stuff.
with the
Yeah.
cats and everything
Yeah.
every single time. So we did that. And, I was running back and forth to the bomb shelter, back and forth. And for those 11 days, I was doing only activities that I could stop on a dime. Like I basically just ate instant ramen because I was really nervous about cooking a full meal and then hearing a siren
Mm.
and then forgetting to turn off the stove and burning the whole place down. So I basically just ate like instant foods. And I didn't shower for 11 days because I thought, what if I hear a siren while I'm washing myself, and like I would have to run to a bomb shelter with like soap in my hair and a towel wrapped around my
Right.
body. That would reveal my femaleness real quickly.
It's not only just like the war threat, but also your identity and all that stuff. And
At that point it was beyond identity. It was like it was about
what's
the
that?
life I was living,
Yeah,
the
the
secret,
dual.
the dual life. And
Yeah.
so, and so I did the activities that I did or anything that you could stop on a dime.
Right.
And so I spent a lot of time on social media, mostly on Instagram, where I saw my leftist American friends basically talking about how Hamas terrorists are freedom fighters.
Mm.
And I thought, well, surely they're thinking this because they don't know the other side of the story. Like, they didn't have a chance to study in Israel. They didn't have a chance to be exposed to this other side of the conflict. And so I just thought, well, surely if I just present them with a more comprehensive set of facts, that they will incorporate this within their logical calculus and that they will come to a more informed decision. So I spent a lot of time on the internet coming up with credible sources to basically showcase, like, you do realize that Hamas uses the Palestinian people as human shields. They thoroughly embed their military infrastructure with their civilian infrastructure. And, they launch rockets and like a quarter of them land in Gaza and kill civilians in Gaza. Like, do you not understand what's going on here? Like, these people are brutal terrorists, and they're not freedom fighters.
Yeah.
They're a liability to the Palestinian people. So, I basically put a lot of screenshots on Instagram and I try to argue with these people. And instead of incorporating anything I've said or even considering it for even a second, they immediately start bombarding my DMs, calling me a colonizer and a settler sympathizer. And, as I'm running from rockets, these leftist Americans who are posting and tweeting at me from some boba shop in California are saying that I'm speaking from a place of privilege.
Mm.
So, two things happened for me in that moment. The first of which is that I became extremely disillusioned with the Western left. I realized that even these kids who I knew from high school debate were not coming to their opinions logically, but rather ideologically. So, I became disillusioned with the Western left. And then, secondarily, because I had done all of this research, this pro Israel, anti Hamas research, the algorithm started to feed me a bunch of right wing content.
Mm.
And so I started to be exposed to, the problems with like the, Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd protests that were raging at the time. And then, like, the more I kicked around in those rabbit holes, the more I sort of was exposed to some of the first content that was critical of
Mhm.
the whole transgender movement, the men and women's sports. And then I came across the stories of detransitioners. And I thought, well, surely, like, once I become legal in Israel and I have access to the healthcare system, because I embarked upon the process of becoming an Israeli citizen because I wanted to medically transition as well, because I knew that, like, my social transition would only go so far. Like, it was already, the older I got, the harder it was for me to foresee a future in which people actually took me seriously as a guy, because I already looked very young for my age. I mean, even just presenting as a woman, I look very young for my age. So if I were trying to pass myself off as a dude without like facial hair or any like, secondary male secondary sex characteristics, I knew that like my ability to maintain this lifestyle would be very, very limited if I didn't escalate it by medicalizing. And so that's why I embarked upon the process of Israeli citizenship. And I thought, you know, um, before I become an Israeli citizen and embark upon this path, surely I should know why people regret it. And so I listened to the stories of detransitioners and, a lot of these girls whose stories I listened to, like, they were very feminine straight women. And so when I looked at their stories, I was like, well, surely that's not me. Like,
Mm.
I'm not going to regret this. I'm a true transsexual. Like, I've been this way, I've been this way forever. Like, this is how my identity has been based around since I was 12. Like, so, but I started to, in their stories, the more of them they listened to and the more I became obsessed with this topic, researching and reading about it, the more I realized that there were a lot of really unethical practices going on. And
Mm.
like,
Mm.
I became disillusioned with the prospect of transitioning kids. I started to realize that there's no evidence underpinning any of it. And so for a couple of years I was questioning it, but I was still very much trans and still very much hell bent on medically transitioning and binding my breasts and the whole thing. I mean, I started to have my doubts, which I didn't, tell anybody about because that would require me to tell them that I was female. So I was kind of wrestling with this for a few years and just, but, you know, the more I questioned it and the more I started to contemplate, like, how is it that we're doing this, we're medicalizing people upon the premise that they have this gender identity mismatch, and we can't even prove that gender identity exists in the mind or in the body or anywhere else. There's no x-ray or MRI that's going to show you a gender identity. Like, why are we medicalizing people upon this basis? Like, so I started to question everything. And then, over the last year of my transition, I'd say, like, I began to believe less and less in what I was doing, but I just didn't know how to untangle myself from it
Mm.
because everybody knew me as a man. And like, I'd say that the major breaking point in my life where my journey took a totally different turn was really on October 7th of 2023. Um, like, I woke up to a siren at 8 in the morning and um, I was like totally, at first I thought they were just testing it. I thought they were testing the missile system because I was in Jerusalem at the time, and in Jerusalem we don't usually actually get rockets. I mean, in 2021, we only got a couple symbolic rockets. But like and so I thought surely they're just testing it, but like it was on Shabbat and the Sabbath and because of all the the restrictions of Shabbat by Jewish law, like they're not going to be testing a missile system
Mm.
on Shabbat that requires electricity and creating circuits and things like that. But like I didn't know that because I was not like born and raised in Israel. I was there for a few years at that point, and um, so I looked up on the internet to see like, are they testing the missile system? And I couldn't find anything on it like about this on the internet. And by the time that I had loaded the page, I heard multiple large booms.
Mm.
And I was still in denial. I was like, there's no way. Like, they're just doing construction. This is a really weird coincidence. And then I hear another siren. And then I'm like, damn it. And and the siren just, it sound like I hear the sound of rockets piercing the air. And, and it's like they're getting closer. And I didn't have a lot of time. And this was a new apartment. I didn't know where the bomb shelter was. And I just didn't have the time to both make it into the bomb shelter and to put on my breast binder.
Mm.
So that whole day, because that thing when you're sweating, especially, like it takes time to get into, but especially when you're sweating and you're shaking, like and like hyperventilating, I mean, it restricts your lung capacity and all this other stuff. And I just didn't have the time for it. I basically just layered on a couple shirts, hoping to obscure the presence of my breasts, and I just ran for it. I had to run to the bomb shelter, and so that entire day, I was running back and forth between the apartment and the bomb shelter, and like, I mean, I had to feel my body move naturally without the constriction of the breast binder, and it was in those moments that I realized, like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I don't believe in it. I don't believe in what I'm doing anymore. And it's so impractical. Like, I my gender troubles just inexplicably disappeared when life and death was on the line.
Mm.
When I had actually pressing things to worry about, my gender issues became the least of my concerns. And like, from the previous war that I had lived through, or I guess as the Israeli locals would call it, a military operation, I had realized really that transition is really impractical when you live in a country that's super prone to war, and you never know the extent to which, like, how long the war is going to last, how much it's going to interrupt supply chains, like, you just don't know. And so it becomes really really impractical to do this. And like, I guess I just realized as I was running from rockets on October 7th, especially, that like I was lied to as a teenager and told that there was something wrong with my body. That because I was so nonconforming and because I felt uncomfortable with my body, that it meant that my body was literally wrong, that my body was a pathology. And I just realized as I was running from rockets that my body is not a pathology, that my body is my body is me. My body is the only thing that's going to allow me to survive in these life and death scenarios. And I need it to be fully intact and in its healthiest state in order to weather whatever life throws at me.
Mm.
And so, yeah, and like, I mean, it was October 7th was just like the worst day of my life. I mean, like, I was supposed to be at one of the hospitals well, I was supposed to be at one of the festivals that got raided by Hamas.
Mm.
But a few days before, the sober ride just like dropped out because he just got really annoyed with us because we were all part of this like Israeli Palestinian peace group and
Mm.
Jews and Arabs trying to organize stuff together. It's just total chaos. Like,
Wow.
and so he just got really annoyed with us and he was like, I need a beer just to deal with you people. Like, I'm not going to be your sober driver. So,
But
and
you
yeah,
came 2 days away from
no,
possibly being in.
3 or 4 days. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
And, and I didn't know at the time that it wasn't just your average, like they're launching rockets.
Right.
I didn't know, like I didn't know that
This was like a
they had
large
broken through
scale. Yeah.
I didn't have a clue. And I found that out throughout the course of the day. I opened up, Facebook and I saw like live streams
Mm.
of like murders of people my age. And I later found out that one of those people is a friend of mine, a guy I knew from like, drinking
Wow.
the local bars. Yeah.
That's well. I mean that. Yeah, that makes sense in a lot of ways of why that would shift your thinking on so many things.
Hmm.
That's a wild experience, though. In it, so yeah, I mean, obviously that changed. Did that change your entire ideology on just kind of everything?
Well, as I discussed before, it was a gradual shift. Like, I first became disillusioned with the left when I realized how that they were supporting atrocities,
Hmm.
like absolute atrocities, things that are just inexcusable. Like, I thought, like, even if they don't care about the Jews, which I already knew they didn't, why the hell are they supporting these terrorists who, when they're not hell bent on killing all the Jews, they're hell bent on like destroying the futures of their own children. Like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
Palestinian society is just thoroughly embedded within this terrorist ideology, like not just Hamas. I mean, the where the Palestinian society starts and, where Hamas ends and where the Palestinian society starts, it's difficult to discern because like from toddlerhood on, these babies are being brainwashed. Like they're, how like American parents will post these pictures of their newborns wearing some kind of little cute little hair bows or whatever, and they'll lay them down on like a cloth that says like, 1 month old, 2 months old, whatever. They take
Yeah.
pictures of their babies like that. You know how Palestinian parents take pictures of their newborn babies?
I don't know. I was gonna guess with like guns or something like that. I don't know.
Knives,
Knives, yeah.
guns, yeah.
And well, now I was gonna
Yeah.
point out, you can probably, because you probably know way more about this than I do, but I believe it's in the Hamas charter to like exterminate all Jews or something like that, right? Isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they see Israel as like just a blip on the map that stands in between them and their vision of creating an Islamic caliphate.
Mm.
So like these are not people who actually want a state. Like if you want to actually have some kind of a nationalist movement, you don't want your leaders to be jihadis
Hmm.
because jihadis don't care about sovereign nation states. They don't like the idea that there would be some kind of, governance other than the governance of like, a local mufti and at the most basic level, but at a greater level, just Sharia law being your form of government. They don't want any kind of they don't like sovereignty. They want to establish a caliphate. They want to take over the world. Israel is basically the barrier between jihad and the rest of the West, which is why, like, you know, Hamas is one of Iran's proxies. Like, it's not even a Palestinian movement. It's just straight up an Iranian proxy, kind of like
Right.
Hezbollah is not a Lebanese movement. They have a party in the Lebanese parliament, but
It's just an arm of,
it's just an arm of
yeah,
Iran, and
yeah,
same with the Houthis in Yemen. Like, and so the motto of Iran and its proxies are just literally just, death to Israel, death to the Jews, death to America, and death to the West.
yeah,
Like when they exterminate the Jews, they're going to be knocking on your door next. Make no mistake. Like they talk about that openly.
yeah. There's no friendliness to America in any of that. Yeah,
No, but a lot of these leftists also hate America, so it's like, but I just don't think they understand the nature of the barbarity and the
right.
of this contingent and like a society that sees the deaths of its own children as a good thing because now they've become martyrs. Like that's not
Yeah,
a
that's
society that you can actually make peace with. Like the kids of Palestine are ultimately victimized by their own parents and their own society. Like the parents who disagree with this stuff, they've left.
mm,
Like they no matter how hard it is, they find ways to get their family the hell out of there. And largely the people who stay behind, they agree with the ideology. They agree with Hamas.
mm,
They're now becoming disillusioned, perhaps because Hamas has shown that it's not as good at killing the Jews as it had promised, and that it's causing a lot of suffering for the Palestinians. But like, I mean, those kids are being actively indoctrinated and brainwashed. And there's this Israeli documentary of like a Palestinian baby from Gaza, I think it was, and he was airlifted into Israel and he got a heart transplant from a Jewish baby. And the reporter or the filmmaker asked the mom, "Well, like now that your son has a new lease on life, what do you hope for him?" Like, and she said, "I hope he becomes a martyr." Her infant,
no,
who had
who just
just
had a heart
who
transplant.
had just had his life saved
Yeah,
by a Jewish baby. This mom, her greatest hope for her son is he would like die in some kind of a bus bombing or other suicide attack. That's insane.
yeah, it is.
Like,
Yeah, yeah, and all the other stuff always drew, like, it just kind of breaks my brain too. Yeah, like all the, because we're in Portland here, and there was a huge PSU protest. They took over the library that was pro-Palestinian, and I could just never square because a lot of those people, many of them are literally part of the LGBT movement,
mhm.
as they would call it. And just not understanding that not only could they not exist there, but I mean, don't like women not have a lot of rights there either? Like, there's so many things that in the West we enjoy that would not be available there. That I never understood that. Living in a progressive city like this, that there's a lot of them in the U.S., but I don't know how people justify that in their mind.
Well, it's all part of this kind of Marxist ideological push. Like, if you think about it, these people, the like, queers for Palestine, like, there's a reason that they're not gays for Palestine. They're
Mm,
queers for Palestine. I mean,
mm.
queer is just an umbrella term that includes gays, trans people, and straight people with kind of radical political beliefs. Like,
Yeah,
queer is
it's a huge umbrella
it's a
term for
yeah.
asexual, like all that stuff. Right? Like, isn't there
Yeah.
a bunch of different?
Right, it's an
Yeah,
umbrella term that, like, it used to be a slur used against gay people, but then it became an academic kind of theory or an academic approach that basically aims to, blur boundaries and to break social norms. So the queer theory mindset basically says if there's a norm, like norms are bad because they're norms.
mm,
And so as soon as something becomes a norm, they want to shatter it, including, and the queer theorists were never in favor of gay marriage because they thought that, gay marriage was a way to sort of make gays quote unquote normal, like
right.
heteronormative, not
And
engage in public, orgies, and that it would encourage gays to like settle down and get married. And they saw this as a really bad thing.
because that would become a norm.
Yeah, because that would be because that's heteronormative. So like these queer theorists really just they hate norms and they and they hate boundaries and they hate borders, like, and so they don't have any allegiance to any country. They have they of course these people think that the United States is like the worst country on earth, and I mean they buy into all of these radical beliefs, and this is just yet another radical belief of like, yeah, like the West is bad, and everything that's non-Western is like automatically good. And so,
Which is just insane. It's crazy to me. But
yeah, so that's why they believe in it. I mean, they don't like, and then
it's
if
really
you,
just a contrarian kind of take on everything. It sounds like, right?
it's more like a revolutionary take.
Yeah. What's an
Yeah.
extremist? Yeah, I'm just only saying that because it sounds so simplistic to just think about life that way of like, hey, I'm just against anything that is viewed as like stable or normal or,
Well, yeah, because they see it in like the dichotomy of the oppressor versus the oppressed. They
right, right.
basically see every
It all
interaction between people and between political parties and between nations, and just every possible interaction they see as being defined by the oppressor versus the oppressed. And this is a dichotomy that they get from Marxism, where, Marx defines this kind of polemic as, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And so you just take those words out, and that you distill it to its core.
it's like the
And
haves and have-nots basically and
oh, it's beyond that.
yeah.
It's not just the haves and the have-nots, it's the oppressor versus the oppressed.
Yeah.
It's and so they basically, this is their framework through which they view everything in the world, and they basically see like, disadvantage that exists in the
Yeah.
world. And
Everything
in
becomes who's holding the power and who doesn't have the power.
right, and so when you look at something like, Israel versus Palestine, the way that they look at that, the way that they, from an ideological perspective, understand the nature of that conflict is they see the Jews as the oppressors because the Jews actually succeeded in getting a state.
Mhm.
And also because they see a lot of deaths on the Palestinian side, because though the Palestinian Authority and Hamas have gotten billions of dollars in international aid, they have not used any of it to build a single bomb shelter. Instead, they've built in Gaza an elaborate tunnel system that's probably the largest, underground tunnel system in a city, in the world. And they use it to store their weapons and for like Hamas, the heads of Hamas and their families to be safe, while the people of Gaza remain as human shields above ground. So they use their tunnels, they use their underground, storage capabilities, to protect their weapons, and they use the people to
Yeah.
protect their weapons. So like they put people in harm's way, and then Israel does its best to try to eliminate, you know, as many chances of civilian casualties. They've been known to call off airstrikes because they saw a kid playing soccer outside. And like in this war specifically, they have done they've been insanely precise. Like they've literally established entire humanitarian corridors, and they've warned people ahead of time where they're going to bomb, and they've ensured that that people can get out. And the problem obviously with this strategy is that a lot of Hamas people, they'll wear civilian clothes, and so they can just
Mhm.
blend in with the local population. So Israel actually puts its own soldiers at risk, in harm's way, to because they know that they're dealing with an enemy that doesn't care about its own people.
Mhm.
And so like, yeah, so no matter what Israel does, like there are going to be high rates of civilian casualties, and but compared to like the number of Hamas killed, like the actual civilian casualties, it's like they're they're shockingly low. And yet like the world just expects that, the world basically holds Israel to an impossible standard. They say, if you get attacked, you don't have a right to fight back.
Mhm.
If you, you know, like they expect, the world expects Israel to like fight in a war that it didn't even want to start. It didn't start. It didn't want this. And they just expect that Israel is going to like fight a war and have zero civilian casualties. Like
Well,
it's
another
insane.
another thing I keep thinking is the hospital thing. You know what I'm talking about? They
Yeah.
purposefully use
El Sheep.
hospitals,
Yeah.
and that's
Mhm.
over the tunnels, I think, right, or something like that. About, but it's all this stuff that kind of shows that they don't really care about their own casualties. It would seem.
They actively want to maximize their civilian casualties
Yeah.
because they know that stupid Westerners, really naive and delusional people, who think they're supporting the right thing, but have no clue that some societies don't value life, they value death,
Hmm.
including the deaths of their own children.
And one thing that drives me crazy too, I remember, and it probably still happens, but I remember in the past few years hearing a lot from, the pro Palestine side. They pull these numbers, and a lot of times the numbers are literally from Hamas.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, and it just drives me crazy because it's like, I understand people want to be humanitarian, but it's like you're not scrutinizing any of this stuff. You're just taking numbers directly from the actual terrorist organization and claiming that as, truth. Um, but that's wild. Yeah, I didn't know you were actually there on October 7th. That's wild. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm gonna get back to so did you immediately kind of start to detransition, or you said it was a slow process at that point?
So, I left Israel maybe about a week after October 7th. I wanted to stay, but my parents were like, "Oh, we bought you a plane ticket. We're getting you out." Um, and
I could
the
just
Israeli national airline has horrible customer service, and so they didn't like. They said, "Okay, if you can refund the ticket, if you can cancel the ticket and get us a refund, then then whatever, that's fine." But like,
They were
I
worried
couldn't do
about
it,
you,
and
and
so yeah,
they
sorry.
were they extremely worried, I'd bet, at that point.
Well, yeah, they ordered me a plane ticket as soon as they heard about this
Yeah,
stuff. Like,
yeah.
and so yeah, like I came back to the States and I had to deal with a lot all at once. I'm just gonna adjust my position.
Yeah, it's all good.
Um, can you still hear me like this or like?
Yeah, you can just pull that thing up a little bit forward, it's fine.
Okay.
Or I mean, pull the mic forward, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I would say that it was it was a gradual process. Like once I'd gotten back from Israel, I had a lot on my plate all at once. Like I was recovering from the psychological aftermath of what the hell had just happened to me.
Sure.
And whenever I heard just like a car driving by or a motorcycle, I thought that it was a siren. Like my brain started making up sirens where there weren't any.
Yeah. It's
Like
like
the
legit
anything.
PTSD, pretty much.
Presumably that's what it. Yeah, presumably that's what it is. I mean, I would even though like the sound of the wind or like a motorcycle driving by or a car or just loud construction noises, like I would just start to panic. And so I was dealing with that at the same time as I was dealing with the psychological aftermath of basically giving up on the plan that I devised for my life from the age of 12 that I was so hell bent on pursuing. Like I moved all the way to a country that is like prone to war because like this is what I wanted to do with my life. And I kind of had to mourn the loss of the dream too once I realized that it was all built on a stack of lies. And and then, like I'd stopped biting my breasts and I thought that like I'd gotten out of this experience unscathed because I managed to not inject toxic doses of testosterone into my body or get my breasts removed. So I thought, okay, like I've made it out of this experience unscathed. But the longer that I went, not binding my breasts, the more I realized that the pain that I was experiencing in like my breasts and in my rib cage and my back and the pain that I was having while trying to take deep breaths, that this wasn't actually going away. Like it actually started to get worse. Like, and it took me months to realize. It took me probably like 6 months to realize that, like, whoa, this thing that I thought was like so safe and reversible has like caused me damage, like bodily damage that isn't going away. Like, I mean, yeah, like nobody who encouraged me to bind my breasts at the age of 12 told me that there would be permanent damage, even doing it with so called safe binding methods. And so,
And that's something you still live with.
yeah, I mean, I'm adjusting my position a bunch of times because cause like my back is killing me and like I can't take deep breaths without pain. Like and nobody told me I'd experience this. Like, even if I want to walk up the stairs at like at a normal pace, I have to wear like a pretty high compression sports bra. Otherwise, I have like nerve pain and like, yeah, my breasts are like disfigured. I mean, that obviously happens when you squash them down for that many years, especially while you're growing. And like, nobody has any answers for me. I mean, and what's even more insane to me is that when I started to experience this rib pain, probably when I was like 19, and I went to the doctor's office at my university, um, I came in for the flu, and while I was getting a flu test done, this doctor is asking me about my symptoms, and I'm telling her about my symptoms, and I tell her, I'm also experiencing like this pain in like my ribs and my kind of my back, and she looks at me, and she also like sees that I changed my name in the portal. And so, and she sees that I'm very gender nonconforming. She asks me what my pronouns are. She asks me, if I had received any gender confirmation, as they called it back in those days, and gender confirmation services. And I told her the whole thing, like, no, my parents aren't. They're paying for my college. They're not going to let me do this. But like right now, I'm just kind of like binding my chest, um and instead of telling me that at the very least, that like my binder could be causing this rib pain, which you would think that a doctor with, or just a normal person with two brain
Come,
cells who know what a breast binder is,
yeah, come
would
to that
tell you
conclusion.
not to wear it, like or would tell you that your rib pain is very, very likely to be related to that. Because I had floated a few possibilities by her. I said, like, I don't know if it's the flu, because I'd never had the flu before. I was like, I
Mhm.
don't know if it's a flu symptom. I don't know if it's that I'm wearing a really heavy backpack all the time. Like, I don't know if it's because I was born prematurely, and so I've had muscle tightness and muscle pain my entire life, and just back pain, and different pain throughout my body. Like, I floated a bunch of possibilities by her, and yeah, and so instead of telling me to take off the binder, at least while I was recovering from a respiratory infection, where you need to be able to take deep breaths, um, instead of that, she said her ears perked up when she heard that I identified as trans and that my parents weren't letting me transition. And she said, look, now that you're legal adults and now that you're on the campus health insurance, if you want, I can refer you to the gender confirmation services that we partner with as a campus. And these services will be fully covered by the campus health insurance, and the extent to which they aren't covered by our insurance, you can get on the state health insurance and have them covered through that. And your parents wouldn't know. They wouldn't have to know. They wouldn't be getting the medical bills or anything. We can arrange for that. Now, I didn't trust these people, obviously, because the same university system had told me that if I changed my name in the portal, it's
Yeah,
not going to get back home to my parents. But obviously, that was a lie. And so, like, I didn't trust them and I didn't take them up on it. But it's just insane to me that instead of telling me to stop binding my breasts, or that that the pain that I was feeling in the part of the body that I was actively constricting was like, that this could be causing me damage and that I should get the damage checked
yeah,
out. She refers me to people who would remove my breasts on the taxpayer's dime.
yeah. Arguably, make it worse on several different levels. The very same pain you're talking about, and that is wild because it's like such. It's so the elephant in the room of, especially from a doctor, of like, could it be this? Could it be this? Could it be this? And you're just totally ignoring
Yeah,
the actual thing that's doing it.
she ignored everything except for the
Yeah.
trans thing. Like, it just totally, and like it just totally subverted all of her judgment. Like, trans seems to be this magic word that causes people to thoroughly and fully lose their common sense.
Mhm.
Like, we know that kids play dress up. We know that kids just say things and they pretend to be things. But then if the kid says that they're the opposite sex, suddenly, if we don't tell them that they are literally the opposite sex, and we don't put them on a pipeline of social transition, and then, puberty blockers, which, when in 98% of cases, are followed up by cross sex hormones, is a 100% chance of chemical castration, especially when you follow the protocol of blocking kids' puberty at Tanner stage 2. the boys will never have any kind of sexual function or sexual pleasure as adults. You're stopping them from developing that.
It was wild to me. I had I believe she's a detrans therapist on here a long time ago, but we were talking about this, and it just that part of it always blows my mind because it's like, isn't the whole point to have like achieve some kind of sexual fulfillment in the end, but you're destroying that in that path, right?
Well, I don't think the point of gender medicine is actually to achieve sexual fulfillment. I mean, we can get a little bit into that element of it, but like
Or to be comfortable sexually, maybe. I don't know what the
the goal,
yeah.
the end goal of gender medicine is to destroy bodily function, disrupt bodily function of the endocrine system and of body parts, and to damage or destroy any body part that is necessary in order to achieve a certain aesthetic goal. It's about destroying bodily function in pursuit of a perceived aesthetic benefit.
Mm.
That
So it's a
is what
cosme
gender medicine is.
to get a cosmetic, more or less, win, I guess, or a cosmetic ability.
Yeah, the destruction
Yeah.
of bodily function is not a bug of gender medicine. It's actually a feature of it.
Mhm.
Like in order to achieve the end goal,
It's a byproduct of yeah.
yeah, I mean that is when you say that there is some kind of inner essence of a person that can exist in contradiction to their biological sex, and then you try to actually live that out and you try to medicalize it and enshrine it into a person's body forever. That whole process starts with implanting an idea into somebody's mind, and the more effort they put into living out this idea and making this idea somehow appear true by enshrining it into their bodies, they just start to do not only psychological damage to themselves, but also physical damage. And it starts with breast binding and genital tucking for men. And it's especially damaging when you're doing it as a kid and you're still growing.
Mm.
Um, and the damage starts the physical and the psychological distress that leads somebody into this whole thing, then becomes compounded by physical distress
Mhm.
of the breast binding and genital tucking. And because that's so uncomfortable and because it causes damage to the body, then it's like, okay, well now we have to have those body parts removed, or we have to go on hormones to further escalate the social transition. So the whole thing is intertwined. It's basically impossible to truly separate social transition from medical transition, especially when you have these garments like the breast binders and the implements for boys and men to tuck their genitals, including tucking underwear made in size 4T for toddlers. These innocuous garments, so called, are actually highly damaging to the psychological development of a young person and also to their growing body. And it's precisely the damage that they sustain from those interventions that makes it damn near impossible for them to ever come to peace with themselves. And they think that the cure to the damage that they've sustained by binding and tucking is to have those body parts removed entirely so that they don't have to do damage to themselves with binding and tucking anymore. Like the solution.
Right.
Okay. Gender medicine basically proposes a system where, like, they propose physical damage as a cure for psychological distress,
Mm.
and then they propose further physical damage as a cure for previous physical damage.
It's kind of a what am I saying? It's a circular cycle that just, I don't know, feeds off of it. It is what's crazy to me too is this whole, because the way you just described that a couple minutes ago is really made me think of it makes a lot of sense the way you're saying it, but it makes me think of this whole concept of passing. To me is just so interesting because I always think of, and a lot of people bring up, you are just trying to look like a stereotype of a man or a woman in the end, really, right? So it's just weird to me coming from the queer kind of ideology that everything would be just based on your image of one or the other, which seems antithetical to to some degree, to what they're even trying to be, the essence of what they are. Maybe it's not, I don't know, but that always just tripped me up. I'm like, so you're just trying to look like a Barbie doll or like a Ken doll or something. when the message you're also trying to say is anyone can just be who they are. It just seems like those are incompatible ideas, but um,
Yeah. They are they're incompatible, but like the thing is that, gender ideology has a lot of contradictions, a
yeah.
ton. They'll say that your genitals don't define your gender, but then that removing your genitals can affirm your gender. They'll say that gender identity is fluid, but that, kids are born with it, and it's so important that these kids get to live, based on this gender identity concept, based on a feeling that they have, when the cost is their fertility and their sexual function. And and they say that, like, it's fluid, but that kids are born with it, and if you don't enshrine it into their bodies by medicalizing them for life, that, they're going to kill themselves. And so,
Mhm.
I mean, there are so many contradictions within this ideology, and it's because it wasn't just one person or one school of thought that came up with what we now consider to be transgender ideology. Like, it started off as some really niche medical experiments in Germany, some one-offs based on, this attempt of some guy named Magnus Hirschfeld and some of his buddies to explore the concept of like sexual inversion, which was a term that explained both homosexuality and like these, cross sex fantasies, and like fetishistic cross dressing, and, the kind of cross sex embodiment desires, as well as like what they would have been called back then, which was hermaphrodites. People who we'd call intersex now, or more accurately, people who have disorders of sexual development. So this idea of sexual inversion, it was like the first queer umbrella.
Mm.
It was the first queer umbrella. And so, it was some one offs in Germany, and then it moved to Denmark. And the doctors that treated Christine Jorgensen, who we were talking about earlier, thought that, they were doing this because they thought that they were treating this man's homosexuality. I mean, they had already, like in Europe in those days, gay men and sex offenders could choose to be voluntarily castrated.
Mm.
And so they thought that they were just castrating a homosexual and going a little bit further with the rest of it. They thought that what they were doing wasn't per se turning a man into a woman, but that they were just, doing some kind of cosmetic thing because this man was a homosexual and he wanted to live like this. And but then when Christine Jorgensen came up with a narrative of like, oh yeah, I'm a woman, you know, like this narrative he came up with, when that became really popular, the doctors were like, oh, actually, we did this because actually, like, she's a woman on the inside. So, like, the patients and the doctors kind of egg each other on in these really interesting and kind of unethical ways, in my opinion. And, like, Christine Jorgensen, though his endocrinologist thought that he was homosexual, I don't think that he was a homosexual. I think that he was actually, well, I don't know if he was bisexual or asexual, but he did not appear to be a gay man. I mean, he basically, in like one of his memoirs or whatever, he discusses, some crush that he some feelings that he had for a male friend, but the entire thing, frankly, seems kind of retconned and fabricated if you
Mm.
read it. And like, he married. You would think that if like a gay man who transitions, you would think that, especially in those days, he would do it so that he could get married to a man, assimilate into society as a woman, and that's what a woman's role was back in those days. But he basically just like, from my kind of recollection, he just got married to like some dude, and I don't even know if they lived together. They weren't like, it was all to just sort of kind of keep up appearances, but it didn't seem like they were actually involved. They just kind of got married and then kind of went their separate ways. Like,
Mhm.
and so, what's more likely is that this man had autogynephilia, which is basically like it's a condition. It's like some people refer to it as a condition. Some people refer to it as like a fetish or a sexual predilection, where basically it's the proclivities of certain men to basically fantasize about the idea of becoming women. And for a lot of men, this is it's very erotic. It's like, fetishistic cross dressing type of thing. For some men, they for some men, that the ones that are asexual, it's not particularly, fetishistic in nature. Like they're not, masturbating while cross-dressing per se, but they still have this fantasy of being women, and so there are different kind of levels. This condition exists on a spectrum, and there are some men, who are more obsessed with a cross-dressing element, and there are other men who want they want to have like, female body parts, including like breasts and a vagina, and female biological functions. So the men who try to induce lactation and breastfeeding, the men who pretend that they have periods, they are autogynephiles. They are what we'd call like an anatomical
Hmm.
autogynephile. So like, what's far more likely, because like most of the male transitioners throughout time have been autogynephiles. Like, earlier we discussed how Christian Hamburger, the Danish endocrinologist who treated Christine Jorgensen, how he basically saw three subtypes of male transitioners: effeminate homosexuals, fetishistic cross-dressers, and men with extreme body dysmorphia. A sexologist in like the 80s, his name is Ray Blanchard. He's well known in our circles. He basically condensed two of those categories that Christian Hamburger had into one category, and he called it autogynephilia, um, which is, love of oneself as a woman. These men were motivated by, he saw all of these men come into his clinic. Like, he was responsible for figuring out, who do we sign off for a sex change and who do we not.
Hmm.
And he noticed that there were two main types. There were homosexuals, who were the minority, and they were just super effeminate, and it was just easier for them to live as women. And, these, yeah, like it was just easier for them in life to do that. And it was also like a dating strategy, because typical gay men, a lot of gay men are like, they're attracted to masculine men. And so these men are very effeminate. And so were kind of mistreated in the gay community, mistreated by broader society. And so this is the nature of why they wanted to transition. Like, a lot of these men didn't actually have particularly strong distress about their bodies. And the extent to which they did, it was usually, explained by, perhaps, like, I don't know if Blanchard wrote about this, but I've just heard this from a lot of my friends who are gay men who have transitioned, some who have detransitioned, and some who are not detransitioning but regret
Hmm.
what they've done or what has been done to them. And they basically, a common thread line is that a lot of them are survivors of, like, being sexually abused as kids. A lot of them are kind of obsessive, like they have like OCD. They're just extremely, extremely obsessive, and they fixate. And but like, their problem is not with their maleness specifically, and they certainly don't like fantasize about being women. And so that was the minority of men who came and sought sex changes throughout time in the West. The vast majority, however, are men who are motivated by like these cross sex fantasies, and they're either heterosexual, bisexual, or totally asexual. And like, so some of these men, you'll see, like, they date women, and then once they transition, some of them will start dating men,
Hmm.
not because their orientation is actually homosexual in nature, but because their fantasy is being a woman, and they see being a woman as like being in a relationship with a man, where the man is the masculine one, and this trans woman is the feminine one. It's not that they're necessarily actually like sometimes they're organically attracted to men, but usually they're more attracted to the idea of being a woman with a man.
Right.
And so,
They're not necessarily seeking a partner. It's just about the image of. Is that kind of what you're
well,
saying?
it's I mean, they can develop into actual relationships, like, but the reason that the origin of their attraction to men is not the same as the origin of like normal homosexual attraction.
Right. Right.
These men are basically kind of like props for them to affirm
Yeah.
their femininity. And so, like, so when you're talking about like sexual fulfillment or whatever, like, you know, what ends up happening is that a lot of these men, from my basic understanding, like, they will have these kind of cross-sex fantasies, and the more they indulge in that, in especially in a fetishistic way, with masturbation and the release of oxytocin and dopamine during orgasm, that kind of makes them want to seek that out more and more and more. Like, the more they do it, the more they kind of inhabit that fantasy of like, I'm a woman, and it goes from wanting to like being very into the idea of becoming a woman to really like escalating into, if they didn't particularly hate their male bodies before, starting to really hate their male bodies.
Mm, mm.
The longer they indulge in the fantasy. And some of these men, for some of them, their hatred of their male bodies, um, you know, exists. It's stronger than their love of becoming a woman, but they still hate their male bodies because they want to actually have female bodies because that's attractive to them, even if they're totally asexual. Like the ones who are asexual are basically more attracted to the idea of like themselves as women than they are to actual women.
Right.
So what ends up happening in a lot of these cases is that these these men, and traditionally these types of men would have transitioned in middle age. They would have had wives and kids, and only the ones who had the most like severe autogynephilia would consider embarking upon such a path because of how socially stigmatized it was. Like most of these men, they'd be in hypermasculine professions. They'd go into the military, or they'd be car mechanics or whatever. They'd be in these hypermasculine, police officers, right? Hypermasculine professions, wife and kids, and they might have cross-dressed on the weekends or snuck off from the military base to cross dress or whatever. They would do it secretly as like a side thing. But like the desire, the more they repressed it, the stronger the desire would grow until eventually, like if you're a man who has this really strong, then it basically ended up controlling their lives. And so that some of them would seek out transition. But these days, because trans is the zeitgeist, it's everywhere. Like men who have autogynephilia to a much less severe extent, um, are basically being presented with transition as an option, and they're taking it. And also, like, boys are kind of developing these types of cross-sex desires at younger and younger ages.
Mm,
Like, think about it, like kids, if they watch anime, if they're on the internet, like anime porn is like a thing. Like a lot of kids get totally, that's their first experience of like arousal during puberty.
mm.
It's like this anime stuff. Like first they watch it, like pre-puberty, when they're just innocent little kids. They're just watching anime and cartoons and whatever. And then the older they get, the more they start to get bombarded with this highly sexualized content. And they're still kids, and so they're drawn to it. And there's like a huge overlap between like, the like anime content and like gender transformation in a sexual way.
Yeah.
And so like if that's if that's a teenager's first experience of like sexual pleasure, and especially if they're like an obsessive autistic child, teenager, who's bombarded by this like testosterone fueled sex drive, that they're just like, what the hell do I do with this? I'm like
Right.
I'm like
Right.
13, 14, like what, you know?
That's the solution at that point.
Well,
Yeah.
they engage in these behaviors more and more and more. And in these, if they, or even if one of these kids, just of any age, wants to watch like a video of like a boy putting on makeup or whatever, and they spend a lot of time on that video, the algorithm's just going to suggest them more and more and more. And so like a lot of these kids, they'll end up on Reddit or on Discord. And yeah, that's where a lot of these like, trans identified males hang out, trans women. They hang out on forums like Reddit. And one of the most popular subreddits, or what, r slash MTF, one of the most popular questions asked on these forums is, am I trans or is it just a fetish? And so these men basically egg each other on, and they'll say, no, it's not a fetish. Like it's possible that you have this like inner female gender identity, like, and that this is your only way of being of having like this thing that's in your subconscious, be something that you can explore, and you're exploring it through fetish. But like it means that, very possible you're a woman on the inside. And so like, these boys at the end of the day, like a lot of people, like, want to, a lot of people think of autogynephilia, and they basically think of like all of these men as like these evil, disgusting perverts. And like, while I think that absolutely no man, whether he thinks he's a woman or not, should be allowed in women's spaces, like under any circumstances, um, I also think that it's wrong to kind of it's wrong to think that just because a young man is developing these types of predilections that he's some evil pervert. Like
Mhm.
even even the teenage boys who get sucker punched into this, even if it is because they're having these sexual fantasies that they don't understand, like, and that they think makes them girls because this has been totally spurred on by the internet and encouraged, and it's like socially encouraged, and there's an entire ideology who will back them up, and there will be, you know, doctors who will medicalize boys upon this premise. Like, those kids are victims too.
Mm.
They are
Yeah.
also just confused boys. They're confused children. They're confused about the kind of awakening of their like sexual urges, just as I was and just as many other kids are at puberty. It's totally destabilizing, especially if you're like kind of spectrumy and you're already not great at interpreting the cues that come from your body, including like hunger and you know, like emotions, the
Mm.
sensations that come along with emotions. Like people on the spectrum are already really bad at kind of interpreting the cues that come from their body and kind of figuring out what that means. They're bad at interpreting, you know, they're bad at sensory processing and things of that nature. So like puberty comes along and there are all kinds of new sensations. Like if you're a boy, you'll grow facial hair, and that can be, you know, I would presume very itchy. If you have thick enough facial hair, it'll be itchy. And like, you know, the like obviously the development of your sex drive, that's a bunch of new sensations. Like puberty, you know, growing pain, literal growing pains. Like
Yeah.
puberty is a time of a bunch of new sensations in your body. And if you're a kid who is really bad at interpreting sensations in your body, like that alone will be enough to cause you to develop distress because these people on the spectrum tend to really not like change. And
Yeah.
so there's like this whole spiral. And so, like, you know, I'm not saying that all of these boys who are like declaring trans identities are necessarily developing these kind of sexual desires, but like, I do think that a lot of them are. And the internet is absolutely encouraging this and spurring it on, and it's taking what could have been like a predisposition
Mhm.
that a particularly obsessive type of autistic teenager might have and just putting it on steroids. And then there's this entire system willing to tell these boys, they're like, oh yeah, like your like cross-sex fantasies mean that you're actually a girl. And then they'll castrate that boy, and then suddenly the reason why he transitioned in the first place becomes null and void. He's not getting any more like sexual gratification. You know, he's getting closer to adulthood. And now he's just like, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
Like, and so it's like, I think that instead of either shaming these boys and young men who are developing these desires, instead of shaming them for it, and also instead of telling them that they're girls, we need to start telling them what's going on with them and try to help them understand the nature of their condition, which which basically makes it so that the more they engage in this type of behavior, the more they let this be not just a bedroom activity, but an entire way of life, like living full time as a trans woman. Instead of doing that and like escalating these types of fetishistic behaviors to the point where you will no longer get the same type of rush. The more you do it, the less of a rush you get from it, and the more it then becomes, they describe it as like a kind of a romantic thing. Like they develop some kind of a romantic attachment to this kind of female alter ego or to becoming a woman. It becomes not just fetishistic but romantic, because the fetishistic, this kind of carnal fetishistic desire, it diminishes with time the more you live it out. And so then it becomes even harder for them to get out of it, because now you're like a man who's trying to live as a woman, and this puts you at odds with basically everybody. Like most of these men don't pass as women. And so instead of telling these boys that, oh no, it's not a fetish, it's not like a this just means that you're actually a woman on the inside, And then you lead him down this path that's only going to make him escalate this further, instead of figuring out, okay, like what's a middle ground where this is something that you can enjoy for what it is, with with another consenting adult partner, in the privacy of your own bedroom. How do you do that? Like, let's help you figure out like how you can do that, instead of having this thing consume your life, and it's ultimately going to lead to the destruction of your body and make you hate your body, and make you like it's you're ultimately very likely to nullify the very reason that you want to transition in the first place. So like, these none of these kids, whether they're insecure gay teenagers who don't want to be gay, or whether they're just mentally ill and they have like borderline personality disorder, or like literally for whatever reason, it doesn't, like, none of these cohorts of kids that are transitioning for a variety of different reasons, like, none of those reasons are actually being addressed. They're
Right,
literally
right.
just all being funneled into this pipeline that will end with the destruction of their body. And it's with no evidence that it'll even in the long term like improve their mental health. The entire thing is insane. There's no evidence underpinning it. That's why it's being rolled back across the world. Um,
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up, and it's wild because I still hear people pushing back on that that's not even happening. But it's like, yeah, the UK was it the? I was just gonna was it the Netherlands? Because that'd be interesting if it started there, and now that they've. But I can't remember if it was the Netherlands or another country around there. But I know the UK definitely rolled back.
yeah, I mean, a lot of European countries have just totally banned it. The
Yeah.
UK has put puberty blockers into clinical trials, which, is something I totally disagree with, because basically the Cass review found, by like with a systematic review of the literature on the subject, that like there was no robust high quality evidence showing that these mental health outcomes actually improved.
Hmm.
There was no evidence to make assertions like this. And so, like, because all these kind of pro gender affirming studies, they're all pretty weak in my opinion, and not just in my opinion, but in the
Yeah.
opinion of Hillary Cass, who like reviewed.
It was some, yeah. There was just a couple things because I gotta, I'm running out of space on
Mhm.
these things, but we'll wrap it up here. But I did want to ask you about because I'm always really interested in the whole data thing. I've always been of the opinion that like there's not a lot of good data, and the data that we do have is often funded by the pro side, the pro trans side. It seems like. But I was curious. I was gonna ask you specifically about. I always hear people push back on. Well, the detransitioners is like such a small portion of the population, and I always think, well, how do you know that? Because we're going through this whole thing right now, and people like you and you know, people are just getting into this phase of it. So it's like there's no real evidence that it is such a small part of the population.
Yeah, like that. Only 1% of 1% of people detransition. That statistic was based on a system where there was a really high degree of gatekeeping, where the doctors would basically say they would turn away a lot of patients.
Mm,
The bar to entry was really high, but like also, even in those cases, the follow up times were really short.
mm.
And so the
The
longer,
window is
yeah, so
really
like we
small.
know from the little bit of long term data that we have that most patients don't start to regret. They don't experience, most patients don't experience immediate regret. There's like a placebo effect, or if you're putting a teen girl on testosterone or a woman on testosterone, that's a steroid. That
Yeah,
has like
and it's a
that'll make them.
honeymoon period you were talking about earlier too.
Right, like
You
there
know.
it's a placebo, it's a honeymoon period. And so like the way that they used to measure detransition in the olden days, there were a few ways that they measured it, and they had small patient populations and like really really high loss to follow up. Such high loss to follow up, in fact, that a lot of those studies, whenever you do systematic reviews, they're not considered high enough quality evidence.
Right.
Like the evidence base for this stuff is so shoddy, because it's damn near impossible to design a study to try to quantify such an ineffable concept of gender identity,
Yeah.
like, because you can't prove that it exists, and so you're just trying to test based on gender dysphoria and the resolution of it. But like, but then it's like, how do you quantify a feeling? Like, usually there are some surveys, and that's how the Dutch protocol was based upon these really flawed surveys where they'd ask kids questions to measure their gender dysphoria, based on their biological sex. And then after they transitioned, they flipped the questionnaires and started asking these young women who'd been on testosterone for years whether or not they had distress about peeing to stand up, like standing to pee, or about having erections.
Yeah.
And so, like, and the boys that ask questions like, "How do you feel about having periods?" Like, it's insane.
It's a
Like,
very, it seems like, yeah, surveys like that's pretty vague
very
kind of,
vague.
yeah, understanding of
And
what's going on.
right, and like most detransitioners don't go back to their doctors. Like the way that there was one study that tried to measure regret in like the 80s or something, and it wasn't even, I don't even know if you can count this as a study, but they basically tried to figure out, they tried to project regret rates by looking at like how many people in the county who'd been transitioned by this gender clinic, like in the same kind of like area as the gender clinic. They tried to look through the sex marker changes.
Mm.
So if somebody changed their sex marker twice, then it was considered to be like a detransition, like a
Okay.
regretter.
Okay.
So that's how they figured out, like, cuz like who would go through the trouble of changing their sex marker twice unless, they were like really regretting it. But that doesn't take into account the fact that a lot of these clinicians self-selected for the men who they thought would be able to pass most as women. And so if you already pass as a woman, no matter how much you regret it, it's going to be like really difficult to actually try to go back to living as a man, even if you regret it. So they weren't necessarily um, like actually trying to measure detransition. They were trying to measure regret.
Mm.
Detransition is a very hard thing to measure. Most people, either who regret or who detransition, don't go back to the gender doctors who treated them. Especially in the United States, there are no, like, our healthcare system is so totally decentralized that
Yeah.
it's hard. Even if doctors really, really wanted to figure out how the hell their patients are doing, um,
That would make sense too, because
yeah,
you don't want to go back to the same person that affirmed the thing that you're trying to get away from, right? So you go to a different doctor, or
or to no doctor, and you just go back to Reddit, just in
yeah,
in the same
right,
way as a lot of these people when they're
yeah,
transitioning and they start experiencing weird side effects. They're like, "What the hell
yeah,
do I do?" Like, they're not going to go back. They're not going to go back to the doctors because they think that if they tell the doctors about the side effects they're having, that the doctors are going to deny them the hormones. But
mm,
they want to continue doing the hormones, and so they consult with each other about, like, oh, are these normal side effects? And also the doctors don't know what they're talking about. Like, back in the olden days, like what, 20, 30, 40 plus years ago, they told patients, you're a guinea pig. We don't know what's going to happen to you. We know that you're not going to grow a third arm, but like, we don't know what the long-term outcomes of this are going to be. We don't know if this is going to shorten your lifespan. Like, we know that
it seems like they
even,
should still be saying that.
yeah, they should be still
Yeah,
saying that, and yet they're telling people that it's settled science and it's the only treatment for gender dysphoria, and if you don't do it, there's like a high rate of suicide. So it's just, the entire thing is just based
yeah.
on a stack of lies, and like,
The
yeah,
suicide thing drives me crazy too, because it's my understanding that that's an outcome no matter either way. If you follow through with transitioning, that's still a high.
it's not
That's
it's not a how it's not no, it's not a high outcome either way. It's like, there have been studies done on this. Like, we've looked at the data in the UK, the gender clinics, ever since this huge spike in adolescent girls, gender clinics had really long wait lists. And so they looked at children with gender dysphoria who were already receiving gender affirmation versus those who were on the wait list. And for those who were on the wait list, the like percentage of successful suicides was like 0.03.
okay.
It was a
So it's
tiny
kind of BS to begin with,
it
because
was
it's,
tiny percentage, and obviously every single one of those suicides is a tragedy, don't get me wrong. It
but
was
it,
like it
but
was a
it's not.
tiny percentage,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and like the percentage of suicides as measured in the like and I think in Australia also they did a certain study, and they saw like the number of successful suicides was actually like the same. There were a couple kids who had attempted suicide both on the wait list and receiving the gender affirmation treatment. And what they figured out is that, and so then trans activists to this will say, well, it's minority stress. And it's like, well, how, like, actually, like, you would think it's minority stress if you see a trans kid. The idea of a trans kid is like somehow a legitimate concept where you like compare this kind of unicorn that we call a trans kid to a quote unquote cis kid, and then you look at the general population of child who has certain suicide risk versus this other population of the trans kid, and they have an elevated suicide risk. And so these trans activists will say, oh, it's because of minority stress, it's because of transphobia, when actually, if you look at the gender dysphoric child, these kids almost always come in with some kind of other confounding, untreated mental illness.
Right.
And so if you take a kid who has OCD and autism, who has gender dysphoria, and you take a kid who just has OCD and autism, they both have an equal risk of like, of
Yeah,
suicidality.
yeah.
And
You're
it's
almost looking at the completely wrong thing.
you're
Yeah.
looking at the long you're looking at the wrong metric, and so
Yeah.
it's like the whole also that 41% suicide statistic was based off of self-report. It was based off of it included contemplating suicide, like
Mm.
ideation,
Ideation.
and completed suicide. So if you'd even considered suicide, then you're included in that like 41%
Mm.
statistic. And it's like, yeah, I mean, if a lot of teenagers, especially if they're, we know that suicide is it's socially contagious. So you tell somebody about suicide, and then even if they weren't depressed or suicidal before, they will consider it, and then they'll click yes. And also it included like gays, lesbians, and bisexuals
Mm.
and trans in the same survey. So it's just so, and most of the respondents to this survey were like gay, lesbian, and bisexual youth.
Mm.
Most of them weren't trans. So it's like all of these studies that make the claims of gender ideology, you know, that make up the entirety of this ideology, they're based on a bunch of flawed premises. It's just a stack of lies.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking too, especially, in the Northwest or anywhere that's super progressive. I don't buy into that sort of bullying argument. It's like trans kids, if you want to call them that up here, are basically kind of put on a pedestal and really, I don't know. In my opinion, it seems like they're the special, like they're treated really special and everyone they're kind of overly love bombed maybe.
Hmm.
But yeah, and I wanted to also say, like, I don't know. I'm definitely of the opinion that there's a huge, gigantic apparatus that includes the medical community, schools, all this stuff that just pushes this onto kids, and I think that that's wrong. But
Hmm.
I wanted to quickly go through. Is there anything else you want to mention before I want to do a lightning round of all my silly questions at the end because I'm
Oh yeah.
running out of time. But is there anything else you want to mention?
Last thing that I don't think
Yeah.
I mentioned before is that the only reason that they're transitioning kids, and the only reason they started to transition kids in the Netherlands, is because of how poor the adults' patient outcomes were. So because these men,
Mm.
after they'd been transitioned, didn't do well, they weren't improving in any kind of functional measure. They would say that they were happier, at least in the short term, but functionally, like even the Dutch clinicians, they noted this, and they said, yeah, this path is not a panacea. It's not going to solve all your problems. And they noticed a discrepancy between the self-report of the patients where they're like, I'm so much happier now, but no improvement in their function. They weren't more employable. They weren't more able to hold down housing. They weren't more able to find relationships that were stable and long-term. And they also were not like using fewer psychiatric services, which you would expect if the premise of intervening in people's bodies in order to fix the distress, which is a thing in their mind, you would expect that at the very least they would utilize fewer psychiatric services, but they didn't. They
Mm.
didn't. In the short term, they used about the same.
Okay.
And in the long term, their mental health just went into the gutter once they realized that this wasn't a panacea. And so, like,
So
there's a disconnect between the reality and the hope. And then when the clinicians ask these men, what's going on in your life, like, all these men, they'd be saying like, I felt this way ever since I was like 4 or 5, and I've always wanted to, I always thought that I was a girl on the inside, but now that I look like a man because I've undergone male puberty, I will not be able to pass as a woman.
Mm.
And so these Dutch clinicians, instead of thinking maybe we were wrong to try to solve a mental psychological disconnect or distress by cutting into the objective material body of an individual, instead of thinking maybe we were wrong in our fundamental premises about this, like, gendered soul or this gendered essence, instead of thinking, maybe we were wrong, and maybe the patients shouldn't be running the asylum, they thought, no, the patients are the ones who know this experience best. This is
Right.
an experience that we could never possibly relate to because they're this special type of person. They have this transsexual essence. And surely they're saying that they've had this since they were 4 years old.
Right.
And so there must be, because there is this thing as a transsexual adult, that's kind of innate in some capacity, at least in their perception, there must be such a thing as a transsexual child. So we need to get to these children. We need to figure out which of these kids are going to grow up to be transsexual adults, and we need to intervene in their bodies as early as is possible so that they can grow into adulthood and not experience the poor patient outcomes that our current male patients are. So gender medicine, literally, when the trans experiment failed on adults, they started doing it to kids.
Which seems extra fucked up to me, but yeah.
But it makes
Yeah.
perfect sense when you think about it from their perspective. Like,
Yeah.
they
Well, they
believe
heard
all of
this
these things are
person
true.
saying, "I've felt this at a young age, so we got to go younger and start treating it at that age," which is yeah.
Yeah.
Even though the outcomes, like you said, are poor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that is pretty wild. Okay, let me go through these really quickly. I think I have a few minutes here. Um, this is a wild shift. I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
just
Okay.
do you like you don't first of all you don't drive or do you drive?
I'm learning how to drive still. My eyes are kind of
Oh, okay. Well,
messed up,
I
so
guess
I've
maybe
been
I can
learning.
ask this one. When you park somewhere, do you normally pull in or do you back in? Just as a general, like if you saw like a shopping center, would you just pull right in straight with the car?
Probably.
Okay. Do you like crunchy or smooth peanut butter? Maybe you don't like peanut butter,
Mm,
or maybe you're allergic. I've had allergic people.
no, I'm not allergic to
Yeah.
peanut butter. I guess I don't think I have a strong preference of
Okay.
peanut butter textures, really.
Either one. Do you have? And I've had people who don't even like Taco Bell. Do you have a Taco Bell order that you normally get?
I haven't eaten Taco Bell in years.
Okay, that's okay. I've had people say that too. Um, this is a new one. It's kind of weird. Do you know there's like pink and white cookies, circus animal cookies? You know what I'm
Oh
talking about?
yeah.
Do you like those or the animal crackers, the ones with a little train box?
Oh, the circus cookies.
You
Those are
like those?
better.
The
Yeah.
sprinkle ones? Okay. Do you use an alarm
Oh
to wake
yeah.
up?
Multiple,
Okay.
multiple.
Do you wake up before it, or do you just like I wake up automatically before it?
It depends. Sometimes I wake up a bit before it. Sometimes I wake up to the alarm. It really also just depends on. I mean, my cat is like my biggest alarm, so
Okay.
he will wake me up very often before the alarm.
Okay. Do you have a favorite type of French fry? Do you like crinkle cut, regular cut, curly fries, waffle fries?
I mean, I guess waffle fries are the best, but I'm actually not a huge fan of fries in general.
Okay. Okay. Let's say you're getting ice cream somewhere. Do you go waffle cone, regular cone, cup?
Waffle cone.
And what flavor are you putting in there?
I mean, totally
You
depends.
like variety and
I mean, my
trying
favorite
different.
flavor is Rocky Road.
Okay, there you go. Do you believe in Bigfoot?
I mean, I believe that people believe in Bigfoot.
Okay, I like
So, I
that.
mean, is Bigfoot real? Bigfoot is kind of like God, real to the people who believe in it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, if you were forced or were given the option to run a brand or a company, is there one you'd want to run?
Ooh. I would run a company of stylish, stylish vests
Mm,
and Oxfords made for women's bodies and shoe sizes and
that's
stuff like
cool.
that.
Clothing, yeah, I like that. Um, I always ask people, do you have a good meal somewhere or just a local business you want to shout out? I guess it could
Um,
be. It doesn't have to be local. I know you don't want to say too much about where we are here, but is there or if there's like a chain or something you really like?
God, it's
I
been
love Starbucks. I get made fun of for that.
um I really like there's a really cool Georgian place that I've
Okay.
tried in Vancouver, Washington that's called Dadico.
I know exactly where that is.
It's
I've
the
never been
most
there though.
incredible food I think I've ever eaten in my life.
That's actually right by I shouted out Treat Ice Cream the other day, and that's
Oh yeah,
right next to
yeah.
that, yeah. Okay, I just wanna give you a chance like, where's the best place if people wanna reach you? What are your socials, all that stuff?
Yeah, totally. I'll also send you all those links. But I'm on Substack. I'm on X. I spend a lot of time on X. I have a YouTube channel that I post some videos on occasionally. I have some clips I put on TikTok and on Instagram. But yeah, I'm sure those will be in the description or
Yeah,
wherever this is. Yeah,
yeah,
I'm
I'll put
just
it on screen
Maya
too.
Poet on all my socials basically.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Sorry, my dog's getting under there.
Hi there.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for coming. This was great. You're always welcome back if you want to do another show. And
Oh yeah,
thanks for
totally.
doing
Yeah.
this. Yeah.